Daniel Pryor signed over 42 acres of dead farmland to his wife in the divorce because it was worth nothing. And 4 years later, that decision destroyed him in a courthouse 40 minutes from the land he'd laughed about giving away. Carolyn Pryor was 44 years old when the papers were finalized. She had been a soil science technician for 22 years, the last 14 of them working for the State Agricultural Extension Office out of Morganfield, Kentucky, 40 minutes southwest of Owensboro. She tested soil. She pulled core samples, ran pH panels, tracked nitrogen and phosphorus levels, read drainage profiles, and wrote reports that told farmers what their land could do and what it could not. She had spent 2 decades walking fields that other people owned and writing conclusions that other people filed. She had also spent 19 years married to Daniel Pryor. She had met him at a regional agricultural conference in Louisville. In the autumn, she turned 25, a broad-shouldered man in a blue-checked shirt who had strong opinions about no-till farming and kept refilling her coffee without being asked. He had been charming in the way certain men are charming when they want something and know how to be patient about it. He ran a mid-size equipment leasing operation out of Henderson County. Tractors, combines, spreaders, field cultivators, and he understood agriculture as a business in the same way Carolyn understood it as a science. For the first several years of the marriage, that had felt like complementarity. It was only later, looking back, that she understood the difference between 2 people who fit together and 2 people who have, for separate reasons, decided to try. They had no children. They had a house in Henderson they'd bought together in the 2nd year of the marriage, a beagle named Gus who slept under the kitchen table, and an inheritance from Carolyn's mother, 42 acres of worn-out farmland in McLean County that had gone untilled for 9 years by the time the papers were signed. Daniel always called it the McLean parcel. He said it with a particular flatness, the way you reference a debt that has no immediate due date but has never left the back of your mind. The land had been Carolyn's mother's land before that. Her grandmother, Ruth Aldridge, had farmed it through the 1960s and well into the 1970s, soybeans and corn in the main fields, a half-acre kitchen garden along the east side of the barn, a fruit stand operation for a single summer in 1968 that never became a second summer, but that Ruth spoke of with fond clarity for the rest of her life. She had been a practical woman. Her hands showed it. When Carolyn was 7 years old, she had asked Ruth what farming was, and Ruth had thought about this for a moment and said, "It's a conversation with the ground. You have to learn how to listen." Carolyn had taken that seriously in a way she did not fully understand until she was an adult. Ruth had died at 89. Carolyn's mother, Patricia, had kept the land but never worked it. Patricia had been a piano teacher in Morganfield her entire adult life, and her relationship to the farm was devotional rather than agricultural. She drove out there on Sunday afternoon sometimes. She walked the fenceline. She said she could still smell the kitchen garden when the wind came the right way. Though by the time she was saying this, the kitchen garden had been gone for 20 years. Patricia died of a cardiac event in January of 2016. She left the 42 acres to Carolyn, and Carolyn inherited the sentimental weight of it along with the deed. Daniel had never been sentimental about it. He had walked the McLean parcel exactly twice in their 19 years together. The first time was the spring after Carolyn inherited it, a single afternoon visit during which he spent 40 minutes kicking at the compacted topsoil in the central field and looking at the cedar scrub encroaching on the south fence line and said, "This is going to take money. We don't have to fix something that isn't going to fix." He had said it without anger. He had said it as a man who has surveyed a situation and found it wanting and is simply reporting his conclusion. Carolyn had walked the fenceland that afternoon while he waited by the truck, and she had pulled 3 informal core samples from the back field with a hand auger she kept behind the seat. Nothing systematic. Just the instinct of a person who reads ground for a living. What she found in those 3 samples was interesting enough that she wrote a note about it in the small field notebook she always carried. The second visit was 2 years later, when Roy Batterman, who ran cattle on the adjacent 400 acres and had known the McLean parcel from a distance for decades, had mentioned to Daniel over a county equipment meeting that the back 30 had some unusual drainage patterns worth looking at. Daniel had driven out alone that time. He had walked the northwest quadrant for 20 minutes and told Roy it was just erosion and driven home. He did not mention the visit to Carolyn. She found out because Roy mentioned it to her 6 months later, in passing, the way people mention things they expect you already know. She had not been surprised. By then she was already 2 years into something she had not told Daniel about. In the months after she inherited the land, Carolyn had begun running systematic soil analyses of the McLean parcel on her own time. Not official state work, she was careful about that. Using the extension lab only on personal leave days and logging the samples under a private project designation. She pulled core samples from 14 locations across the 42 acres, at depths ranging from 18 inches down to 9 feet at the sites that gave her reason to go deeper. She built up a complete subsurface profile of the parcel across 18 months, a map not of what the land looked like on the surface, which was unimpressive, but of what was happening several feet below it. The surface told a familiar story in McLean County. Decades of hard row cropping without adequate rotation had depleted the topsoil's organic matter to below 2% in most of the central fields. The hardpan layer at 18 to 24 inches was real. The appraiser who would eventually assess the land for the divorce proceedings was not wrong about that. The drainage issues in the western third were genuine. A person using standard county appraisal methodology, spending 40 minutes on the property, would have written exactly the report that was written. There was nothing false about that assessment of the land's surface condition. The surface condition, however, was not the whole story. At Site 7, a location in the northwest corner of the back 30, where the ground changed in a way that was only visible to someone who knew what to look for. A slight convexity in the land surface, combined with a specific pattern of vegetation that grew differently here than 20 feet in any direction. The cores below 6 feet told a different story entirely. At 8 feet, the grain and porosity of the material changed in a way that made Carolyn sit on the tailgate of her truck for a long time after she capped the sample vials. The hydraulic conductivity readings were not what they should have been given the geological context. They were significantly higher, and they were directionally consistent. Every core she pulled from the northwest quadrant at depth showed the same signature, the same orientation, the same suggestion of something channeled and persistent beneath the surface. She went to the extension library on a Thursday evening in October, in the second year of her private study of the parcel, and pulled the Geological Survey archive for McLean County. Most of what was there was standard. The state surveys from the 1950s and 1970s, the USTA soil maps, the county drainage studies. She found what she was looking for in a 1987 state water resources study, a systematic hydrogeological survey of McLean County conducted as part of a broader state assessment. It had been commissioned, completed, filed, and not revisited. It covered the county in quadrant sections, and the section covering the northern half of the original Aldridge farm property, which now corresponded to the northwest quadrant of the 42-acre parcel Carolyn owned, had a notation in its hydraulic analysis section that used technical language to describe, in careful and specific terms, an artesian formation of documented size and estimated yield that sat at a depth consistent with her own core data. She read the section 3 times. She went home and sat on the back porch with Gus for an hour in the dark without turning on the outside light. Then she went back inside and looked at her core data again with the 1987 survey open beside her, and she confirmed what she had already understood. The artesian formation was documented. It was mapped. Its location corresponded precisely to her drill sites, and under Kentucky water rights law as it applied to artesian formations on privately held land, it belonged entirely to the owner of the surface parcel, provided the deed included mineral and water rights. She checked the deed. The original deed from Ruth's farm, the one that had transferred to Patricia and then to Carolyn, was a full title transfer with mineral rights appurtenant, drawn up in 1948 by a McLean County attorney who did thorough work. The mineral rights were attached. They had always been attached. No one had thought to look at them in 70 years, because no one had thought there was anything worth looking for. Carolyn closed her notebook. She made tea. She went to bed. She told Daniel none of this. She had her reasons, and they predated the marriage ending by at least a year. She had been watching the thing that was wrong with the marriage for 3 years by then. Feeling it the way you feel a structural problem in a building, not always visible, but present in small, persistent ways, in the quality of the silences, in what did not happen on the evenings when it should have. She had not named it yet, even to herself. But she had begun, quietly and without announcement, to think about what she had and what she would need. The marriage ended in the way of a thing that has been failing for a long time and then becomes impossible to ignore. Daniel had brought in a business partner in 2017, a man named Greg Stouffer, 41 years old, who wore pressed shirts and drove a gray Audi and had grown up in Chicago and talked about agricultural equipment as if it were an investment vehicle. Carolyn had disliked Greg from the first dinner, with an instinct she could not have articulated precisely at the time. She knew, from 22 years of reading ground, that certain surfaces looked like one thing and were something else entirely underneath. Greg Stouffer had that quality. She noticed it and kept the observation to herself. 2 years later, on a Thursday evening in March, she found 17 text messages on Daniel's phone while he was in the shower. The messages were from Greg's wife, Amanda. They were not business messages. Carolyn stood in the kitchen for a long time, long enough for the shower to run out, long enough for Daniel to come out in a towel and stop when he saw her face and understand immediately what had happened, in the way that certain people understand things without being told, because they have been living alongside the possibility for a long time. He said, "I was going to tell you." She said when. He said, "When I figured out how." She put the phone on the counter with care. She went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed where she had slept for 14 years and looked at the window. She did not cry. She would think about that later, the way the absence of tears had surprised her and then had not. She was not surprised, because she had, she understood now, been doing her own silent accounting for the past 2 years. The farm study had not been only about the farm. She filed for divorce 11 days later. The proceedings took 8 months. Daniel hired Thomas Fenwick, a family law attorney in Owensboro who had a reputation for clean, efficient work on high-asset divorces and had handled 3 of Daniel's business associates' proceedings. Carolyn retained Judith Lane, a solo practitioner out of Morganfield, who had grown up 3 miles from the McLean parcel, and whose office had a print of a 19th-century McLean County plat map on the wall behind her desk. Judith had met Carolyn's mother once at a community event and had told Carolyn during their first meeting that Ruth Aldrich had been a woman who left things in good condition for the people who came after her. Carolyn had said, "She tried." Judith had said, "She did more than try." The asset division took 3 negotiating sessions. Daniel's position, delivered through Fenwick in language designed to appear straightforward and generous, was as follows: The house in Henderson had been appraised at $287,000. The equipment leasing business carried equity of approximately $340,000 after liabilities. The McLean parcel had been assessed by a county appraiser the previous April at $38,500, with noted drainage issues in the western third, hardpan across the central fields, and the barn flagged as structurally compromised. The proposal: Daniel would retain the house and the business. Carolyn would receive $180,000 in cash drawn from business equity, plus the McLean parcel, which Fenwick described in the documentation as an illiquid inherited property of modest agricultural value. The framing was designed to read as Daniel being generous about the cash, while acknowledging the farm's limitations. Fenwick had done this work before. He was good at making the numbers look even. Judith reviewed the proposal and called Carolyn at home. "He's offering you the farm," Judith said. "I know. He thinks it's essentially worthless." "I know." There was a pause. "Is it?" Carolyn looked at the notebook on the kitchen table, the one with 36 months of core data and the 1987 survey notation, and the hydraulic conductivity readings from Site 7. She said, "Counter with full title transfer, no liens, and mineral and water rights explicitly attached by deed amendment." Judith was quiet for a moment. "He'll ask why. Tell him it was his mother's land and her grandmother's before that, and she wants it intact as an inheritance instrument. Make it read as sentimental." "Is it sentimental?" "It's that too," Carolyn said. Judith sent the counter. Fenwick called it a non-issue and sent back the amended transfer language without further discussion. He had reviewed it for 3 minutes. The mineral and water rights clause was standard language in full title transfers in Kentucky. There was nothing on its face that distinguished it from the kind of sentimental housekeeping a recently divorced woman might request for her grandmother's land. Daniel signed it without asking a single follow-up question. He was, by that point, focused on the business equity and on the house, and on the fact that he was retaining the assets with real market liquidity. The McLean parcel was an afterthought in his accounting. He had always thought of it as a problem he was inheriting through Carolyn, and now he was shedding it with the marriage and keeping everything that mattered. The settlement was signed on a Tuesday morning in March. Carolyn drove directly from the courthouse to McLean County, 48 miles on state roads, through Henderson and past the grain elevators at Calhoun, and down the county road that dead-ended at the gravel track her grandmother had called the farm lane. She parked at the rusted gate that hung at a 30-degree angle on its post and sat in the truck for a while before she got out. The barn was there. It had been gray for as long as she could remember, and was grayer now, the east wall pulled slightly away from the stone foundation by years of freeze and thaw. The south field had gone entirely to tall fescue and cedar scrub, the volunteer trees advancing in a ragged line from the south fenceline. The central field was bare and pale in the March light, the soil color of exhausted land, a light, almost bleached tan where it should have been darker. The fence along the east boundary had lost 2 full panels and leaned at irregular angles. A stand of honey locust had established itself along the northwest drainage channel. Gus, who had been awarded to Carolyn along with the cedar chest her mother had left and a hand-painted pie cabinet from the kitchen, sat in the passenger seat of the truck and watched her through the windshield with the even patience he applied to all of her longer projects. She got out and walked the lane to the barn. The door had warped badly in the frame, and she had to put her shoulder to it before it moved. Inside, light coming through a dozen gaps in the siding. Cold, dry air. The smell of old hay and rot, and underneath both of those a smell that was older and drier. Something mineral. The smell of a building that has been sealed against weather for a long time and is opening slowly. Her grandmother's hand-forged cultivator teeth were still on the west wall, on the same nails Ruth had hammered in sometime around 1961. Carolyn knew this, because Ruth had mentioned them once. Specifically, had said she'd forged them herself from bar stock at a neighbor's smithy the spring after her husband died, and had hung them because she was going to need them and did not want to look for them. There were 12 ball jars on the shelf of the oak workbench along the south wall, lids corroded but sealed, Ruth's handwriting on the labels in faded marker. Summer squash, Aug 1971. Green beans, Sept 1972. Tomato, Roma, Aug 1971. Carolyn touched the nearest jar with 2 fingers. The glass was cold. The seal had held for 53 years in a barn that had been closed and opened maybe a dozen times in that span. She stood in the barn for a while, listening to it. Old buildings have a particular quality when they are empty, but not abandoned. A held breath quality, as if the structure has been waiting. She went back to her truck and pulled out her field kit, the canvas bag behind the seat with the core sampler, the pH strips, the vials, and the laminated field notebook, where 3 years of weekend work was recorded in her careful, abbreviated hand. She walked the farm lane to the back 30, and out to Site 7, the northwest corner location she had marked on her own maps with a penciled X and a notation she had added the previous autumn after the 1987 survey. Confirms. She pulled 3 new cores. The readings were consistent with everything she had documented. She capped the vials and wrote the date, March 14th, and stood up and looked at the pale, flat ground of the back 30, which looked like nothing, which was the entire point. A truck pulled up on the county road behind her vehicle while she was recording the readings. An older man got out, Roy Batterman, in a Carhartt canvas jacket and field boots with McLean County mud on them, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has worked physically every day for 40 years and has nothing to prove to anyone about his pace. He was 67 years old and had been farming adjacent land since his early 20s, and he had known the McLean parcel from the other side of the fence for most of that time. He had known Ruth by name and her daughter Patricia by sight, and he had watched the land go fallow with the patient observation of a neighbor who does not intervene in other people's decisions, but does not stop watching them either. He walked over to where Carolyn was standing. "You finally took it over," he said. "It's mine now." Roy looked at the northwest quadrant. He had been looking at it from his fenceling for 9 years. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a person deciding how much they already know and how much they want to say. He said, "Your grandmother never tilled this section." "No," Carolyn said. "She didn't." He looked at the core sampler in her hand with a look that was not curious. He had already formed his understanding, but confirmatory. He said, "You know what's under there." Not a question. She said, "I have a good idea." He nodded once, a slow nod that landed differently from agreement. "Your grandmother knew too," he said. "Told my father back in, I want to say 1974, somewhere around there. Said she'd had a state man out. Said she'd decided she wasn't going to do anything about it. Didn't want the trouble." He paused. She was a private person about her business. Carolyn looked at the ground. She thought about Ruth Aldridge, who had forged her own cultivator teeth the spring after her husband died and hung them where she would not have to look for them, and who had been told what was under her northwest field in 1974, and had decided, for reasons that were hers, not to act on it. She thought about the ball jars on the workbench, sealed and labeled and still intact 53 years later. Ruth had been a woman who built things to last and left them where the person who came next could find them. "I'm not my grandmother," Carolyn said. Roy nodded again with the same quality of settled appraisal. he said. "You're going to need to see to the barn before you can put anything in there." "I know." He said, "I've got a skid steer you can borrow." "When you're ready." She said, "I appreciate that." He looked at her one more time with the direct, unhurried assessment of a man who has been making judgments about what people are made of for 67 years and rarely needs to revise them. Then he said, "Come find me when you're ready," and walked back to his truck. Carolyn stood in the field after he left. The March wind came off the flat McLean County ground in long, cold gusts that smelled of thaw and dry grass. Somewhere in the cedar scrub along the south fence, a meadowlark was working its territory. Gus had put his front paws on the truck door and was watching her through the window. She had $180,000 in a settlement account, a barn with a compromised east wall, 42 acres of depleted and fallow ground, and below the northwest corner of the back 30, a documented artesian formation that had been sitting there unmolested since before her grandmother was born. She drove home to the rental house she'd taken in Morganfield 6 months into the divorce proceedings. She made coffee. She opened her notebook to the section she had been adding to, carefully and in small increments, for the past 2 years, a development outline. Not a dream, not a wish list. A plan. Technical, sequential, costed, phased, the kind of document a person writes when they know what they have and know precisely what they need to do with it, and are only waiting on the legal instrument that makes it theirs. She read it once. She made 2 amendments. She closed it. She had 18 months of work ahead of her. The barn was the first thing, because it had to be. She called Roy at the end of March, and he drove his skid steer over on a Saturday morning in April, 4 miles down the county road at walking speed, with Cole, his youngest, following in the truck. Cole was 22 and in the 3rd year of an agricultural engineering program at UK, and had opinions about most things, and was right about them often enough that Carolyn had begun listening carefully when he spoke, which she did not do automatically for people his age. He had his father's quality of observation, without his father's patience for being understated about it, which she found more useful at the moment. She had done the barn assessment herself the week before, working a full day in the cold with a flashlight and a builder's square and a tap hammer, marking the structural map she'd drawn on graph paper with observations at every framing member she could reach. The oak framing was intact, all of it. 67 years of dry storage had been good to it. The mortise and tenon joints at the bents were solid. The siding on the north and west walls was weathered but functional. The east wall had failed where the foundation had shifted, pulling the lower sill off the mud sill by 4 inches and allowing water infiltration that had gone about 8 inches up the lower boards before stopping. The south wall had a section of rotten siding above the doorway that was more cosmetic than structural. The roof had lost 20% of its tin sheeting on the northwest slope, but the purlins and rafters were dry. She had climbed up to check on a clear March afternoon and found that Ruth's overlapping tin method had kept water off the timber for 6 decades. She hired Ed Briggs, who had rebuilt 4 old barns in McLean County over the past decade and understood the difference between restoration and reconstruction, a distinction that mattered to Carolyn, to repoint the foundation, reset the east sill, and re-side the 2 compromised wall sections. Ed spent 2 days on the foundation and 4 days on the walls and told her the framing was some of the best work he'd seen from that era in McLean County. She told him she knew that. He said, "You've been in here before." She said, "I have." The rest she did herself. Weekends and weekday evenings from mid-April through the end of May, the roof tin replacement first, which she and Cole managed over 2 Saturdays with safety lines tied off to the ridge beam, working methodically from the east drip edge toward the peak. Cole had brought a pneumatic nailer from his father's shop and had opinions about seam spacing that turned out to be correct. They replaced 41 sheets of corrugated steel in 6 hours and did it in full compliance with the original fastening pattern Ruth had used, which Carolyn had traced from the intact sections of the roof before they started. The floor was next. The original dirt floor had compacted unevenly over 60 years, and she decided to put in a gravel base, 4 inches of crusher run, over the dirt in the main bay where she planned to store equipment. She rented a plate compactor and did the prep work herself, 2 evenings in May, moving the crusher run from the pile Roy had deposited at the lane in 1-barrow loads and tamping it in sections. Cole showed up on the second evening with a bag of food and the information that his soil science professor at UK had told him the McLean County Artesian Formation was referenced in a 1987 state survey document that almost nobody knew about. Carolyn had put down her barrow and looked at him. He said, "He mentioned it because I've been asking about subterranean hydraulic formations in western Kentucky, and he thought it was interesting context." She said, "What did you tell him?" Cole said, "Nothing specific. I said I was doing field work for a personal project." She looked at him for a moment. He met her eyes without any indication of discomfort, which she noted. She said, "Keep it that way for now." He said, obviously, he handed her the food. He picked up the other barrow handle without being asked, and they finished the floor section in an hour. The oak workbench along the south wall she refinished herself, section by section, over 3 weekends. She worked the cracked and dry wood with a cabinet scraper first to remove the surface oxidation, then applied 2 coats of boiled linseed oil with a cloth, working it in with the grain, letting it cure between coats. The end section nearest the door had dried the worst and had a crack that needed to be filled before the oil went on. She used a mixture of sawdust and hide glue that she made up in a tin can on a propane burner, the same method she had seen described in a restoration manual she'd found at the Calhoun Library. It took 3 applications and 3 cures, and when it was finished the crack was there if you knew to look for it, and invisible if you did not. Ruth's ball jars she moved to a new shelf she built herself from salvaged lumber off the east wall, a 3-board run above the workbench, leveled to a 64th of an inch, anchored to the studs. The jars she arranged by year, earliest to the left, and she set a jar of her own preserves, green beans from a garden plot she'd put in behind the rental house in Morganfield, at the right end of the row. She looked at the completed shelf for a while. It looked right. It looked like something Ruth would have done. The field work ran in parallel to the barn work throughout the spring. She had identified 3 viable well locations in the northwest quadrant through her core data, and in late April she called Dr. Patricia Shen at the University of Kentucky's Water Resources Department. She had read 3 of Patricia's published papers on artesian formations in western Kentucky, and had emailed her 6 weeks earlier under the pretext of a professional consultation. Patricia drove out from Lexington on a Thursday in April and spent 4 hours on the property with Carolyn's data, and then 2 hours at the kitchen table of the rental house with Carolyn's notebook open between them. Patricia Shen had the quality of a scientist who has been surprised by data enough times to have learned to receive surprises calmly. She had read the notebook entry on the 1987 survey and cross-referenced it with the core data and the hydraulic conductivity readings from sites 7 through 11. And she had done the arithmetic with Carolyn's sample documentation laid out in front of her. And by the end of the 2 hours, her composure was carrying some weight. She said, "You've been sitting on this for how long?" 3 years of data collection, Carolyn said. 2 years of knowing what I had. Patricia looked at the hydraulic conductivity numbers from Site 7 for a moment. She said, "You understand what the yield projections on an artesian formation this size and this depth mean for municipal water supply contracts." "I've read the McLean County Water Authority's last 3 requests for proposals," Carolyn said, "and their expansion study from October." Patricia was quiet for a moment. She said, "You're going to need a water rights attorney." "I have one," Carolyn said. "I've had one since January." The attorney was Gerald Puckett, 63 years old, practicing water and mineral law in Owensboro since 1991. The kind of lawyer who wore the same suits in heavy rotation and was consistently underestimated in the first meeting by people who confused low effect for limited capability. He had the habit of winning quietly, and the patience of a man who has never needed to perform his work, because the work had always spoken adequately for itself. Carolyn had found him through a water rights case she had read about in the Owensboro Messenger-Inquirer in the previous year. A case involving artesian formation rights in Daviess County, in which Gerald had represented a private landowner against a county utility authority and won a precedent-setting extraction royalty agreement in 9 months. She had called his office in January, a week after the divorce settlement was signed, and explained what she had and what she needed. Gerald had listened for 20 minutes without interrupting. Then he had said, "Come in Thursday." Their first meeting had run to 90 minutes. Gerald had reviewed her deed documentation, the mineral and water rights transfer amendment, her core data summary, and the 1987 County Geological Survey. He had asked 4 precise questions about the deed history, 2 about the methodology of her soil analysis, and 1 about Daniel. "Your ex-husband doesn't know about this," he said. "No. He had competent legal representation." "He did," Carolyn said. "His attorney reviewed the mineral rights clause and described it as a non-issue in the context of the overall settlement. His appraiser used standard county methodology and spent 40 minutes on the property. Neither of them pulled the 1987 Water Resources Survey. Neither of them went below the surface." Gerald had made a small, non-committal sound. He looked at the deed amendment. He said, "The mineral and water rights attachment was your explicit request." "It was." He put the document down and looked at her for a moment. He said, "I'll file for the preliminary extraction permit in March. We'll want Dr. Shen's hydrogeology report on record before the Water Authority becomes aware of the formation independently. They issued an expansion study request last October, and they're going to come looking eventually." "I read the study request," Carolyn said. He looked at her with the measured and slightly formal appraisal of a man who has been practicing property law for 35 years and is deciding how far to extend professional respect. He said, "I know. The preliminary extraction permit was filed on March 28th. By the time the barn reconstruction was complete in late June, new siding on the 2 compromised walls, foundation repointed and solid, east wall plumb again, roof retinned, the oak workbench refinished and stocked, Ruth's jars on their new shelf. The permit had been issued, and Gerald had initiated the first formal contact with the McLean County Water Authority on Carolyn's behalf, forwarding a summary of the hydrogeology documentation and a letter indicating that the formation was under private ownership with full water rights attached, and that the owner was available to discuss long-term access. In July, Carolyn drove fence posts. Roy had offered the use of the skid steer's post-driver attachment, and she worked the perimeter of the 42 acres over 3 weekends in the high summer heat, pulling the failed wire from the collapsed sections. 214 feet along the east boundary, 80 feet in the southeast corner, and replacing it with new 5-strand barbed wire on posts she drove herself. Working from 6 in the morning until the heat became unreasonable, which in McLean County in July was about 10. The work was straightforward and the results were immediate. The property looked inhabited. It looked maintained. It looked like someone had made a decision about it and had made it for the long term. She had also, during the second weekend of fencing, found the boundary marker stones her grandmother had placed along the east line. 3 granite blocks, each one about the size of a bread loaf, set at the property corners and at the midpoint of the boundary, half buried in the grass and invisible, unless you knew to look for them. Ruth had set them herself in the early 1950s, when the county had resurveyed the parcel and the new survey pegs were temporary wooden stakes that she had not trusted. The granite was still exactly plumb. Carolyn dug around each one with a hand trowel, cleared the grass, and tamped the soil back firm. She stood at the corner marker for a moment, with her hand on the stone, which was warm from the sun, and thought about Ruth kneeling here 70 years ago, and making the same decision for the same reason, that something this important should be anchored in something that would not rot. The south field she cleared with a brush hog borrowed from Roy over 2 weeks in mid-July, working in the mornings, pulling the cedar scrub out by root with the skid steer after the brush hog had taken the top growth. The honey locust stand along the northwest drainage channel she left. Honey locust fixes nitrogen, and the root structure was stabilizing the channel bank, and she had no practical reason to remove it until she understood the extraction infrastructure better. She made a note in the development outline. She seeded the south field in August with a cover crop mix from the Extension Office's soil rehabilitation program, crimson clover, Austrian winter peas, and a small percentage of hairy vetch. The soil in the south field was not as depleted as the central field. It had slightly higher organic matter from the scrub years, which had returned some material to the surface layer, and the cover crop came in quickly in the late summer heat. By the end of August, the south field had a 2-inch stand of green across its full extent. Not pasture quality, not cropland, but alive, which it had not been in 9 years. Roy walked the fenceland from his side one evening and looked at the south field and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That's coming in clean." Carolyn said, "The hairy vetch is doing the work." Roy said, "It does when you give it a reasonable start." Coal came out 3 more times over the summer, each time under the stated premise of an agricultural engineering field study, and each time staying longer than the stated purpose required. He had a quality that Carolyn had begun to appreciate particularly. He asked precise questions and then waited for precise answers, and did not fill the silence between the question and the answer with additional commentary. He had brought a copy of the 1987 County Geological Survey on his second visit in July. He had found it himself in the UK library, and had annotated it in pencil with his own hydraulic gradient calculations based on the data Carolyn had shared with him. His calculations were correct. She told him so. He received this information with a careful restraint that was the young person's version of professional dignity. In September, the McLean County Water Authority sent a delegation. 3 people in agency pickup trucks arrived at the farm lane on a Tuesday morning. A civil engineer named Frank Gettelson, a senior project manager named Diane Mullis, and a young hydrologist named Marcus Webb, who was the only one of the 3 who had read the full hydrogeology documentation Gerald had forwarded before the visit. Marcus was 28 and had the alert, slightly suppressed quality of someone who has found something significant and is being careful about how they present it in front of their supervisors. Frank and Diane walked the northwest quadrant with the manner of people confirming what they had been told and taking appropriate time over it. Marcus walked with Carolyn and asked questions for 90 minutes. He asked about the depth and lateral extent of the formation, the hydraulic gradient orientation, the 1987 survey methodology, the differential between his own agency's projection models and Carolyn's empirical core data. He was specific. He did not ask questions whose answers he already had. He asked only the ones he didn't. At the end of the site visit, Diane said, "We'll need to run our own confirmation testing." "Of course," Carolyn said. If the yield profile confirms at this depth, it will, Carolyn said. There was a brief silence. Diane said, "We'll have a proposal to you by the end of October." Marcus, walking slightly behind, caught Carolyn's eye as the delegation walked back toward their trucks. He said, quiet enough that only she could hear, "Your core methodology is as good as anything we do in-house." She nodded once. He nodded back. She watched the trucks drive out the farm lane and turn onto the county road. Roy was sitting on the hood of his truck at the fence between their properties, watching. He had been there for the last half hour of the agency visit. He had not introduced himself or walked over. He was just there, in the way of a neighbor who has observed more than 40 years of things happening on that land and considers himself entitled to watch new things happen. When the agency trucks were gone, he looked at Carolyn. She looked at him. He said, "Water Authority." "Yes," he nodded as if filing the information. He drove away. The proposal arrived on October 3rd. Gerald called Carolyn at 7 in the morning and read her the headline terms: a long-term extraction easement, 25 years renewable, with an upfront infrastructure access payment and annual royalties tied to extraction volume indexed to the County Water Authority's quarterly rate schedule. He read her the upfront number. He read her the royalty floor. Carolyn sat at the kitchen table of the farmhouse. She had moved in from the rental house in August, sleeping in her grandmother's room, cooking on a second-hand propane range, with Gus sleeping under the bed the way he had always slept under whatever was the nearest piece of furniture, and listened to Gerald's voice on the phone. She looked at the window. The October light was low and amber across the south field, where the cover crop had come in well and was holding against the first frosts of autumn, the crimson clover still green where the ground had stayed warmest. She said, "Counter at 12% above the royalty floor. Quarterly reporting. And I want a surface impact clause. Any extraction infrastructure goes in on the section I've designated. No modification of the drainage channel without written approval." Gerald said, "Already drafted." She said, "The surface impact clause too?" "I anticipated it," he said. The counter took 11 days. The Water Authority accepted the royalty adjustment, the quarterly reporting requirement, and the surface impact clause. Gerald called on a Thursday evening. Carolyn was in the barn when the call came through. She was working on the last section of the oak workbench, the end piece nearest the door where the wood had dried and cracked and needed to be filled and leveled before the oil coat went on. She had mixed the sawdust filler that morning, and the first application had cured enough by evening that she could do the second. She listened to Gerald's summary. She said, "Good." She asked about the easement recording timeline. He said 30 days. She asked about the extraction permit amendment needed for the permanent infrastructure. He said it was already filed. She thanked him, set the phone on the workbench, and picked up the filler again. It was a good piece of oak. Ruth had probably set it in here sometime in the late 1940s, and it had stayed solid because the barn had stayed dry, and because her grandmother had known which wood to use for a surface you expected to work at for the next 50 years. The crack ran about 14 inches and was 3/16 wide at its widest. Not structural, just cosmetic. The filler would hold it for another 50 years if the temperature stayed stable and the barn stayed dry, which it now would. She finished the workbench by lamplight, taking her time. It was Roy who first told her that Daniel knew. He stopped at the fence on a Monday morning in November, when the drilling crew from the Water Authority's contracted engineer was on site doing confirmation testing. 4 people and a drill rig on the northwest quadrant, visible from the county road. The kind of activity in McLean County that people notice and discuss and connect to other recent information. Roy said, as a statement rather than a question. Your ex-husband heard about the drilling. When? Carolyn said. Friday sometime, Roy said. Heard it through the equipment leasing community. Somebody knows somebody at the county surveyor's office. Carolyn nodded. Roy said, he's going to think you knew. I did know, she said. Roy looked at her. You're not concerned. The mineral rights are on the deed, she said. Gerald has documentation of the negotiation. The mineral rights clause was an explicit request accepted by his attorney. There is no misrepresentation. She paused. There is professional expertise, applied to land I owned, in my own time, using knowledge that was publicly available to anyone who knew where to look. Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Gerald Puckett. Since January. Roy made a sound that was neither approval nor disapproval, but had a certain quality of settled confidence in it. He said, all right, and drove back to his property. Daniel's call came through that same afternoon on her cell phone. She looked at the screen for 3 rings. She picked up on the 4th. He said, Carolyn. She said, Daniel. There was a pause. He said, I heard there's something going on out at the McLean property. She said, there is. I heard the water authority is out there. They are. Another pause longer. She could hear him working up to something. He said, I think we need to talk about what was disclosed in the settlement. She said, you should call your attorney. He said, I think Daniel. She said, you should call your attorney. And she ended the call. She put the phone in her jacket pocket and went back to the fence she was repairing on the south boundary, a section of wire that had pulled loose from a post in the October frost and needed to be restapled. She finished the section before going in for lunch. Fenwick called Judith Lane on a Wednesday morning in November. Judith called Carolyn the same afternoon. Fenwick's been in touch, she said. Daniel is claiming the mineral rights transfer was obtained through material non-disclosure. That you had professional knowledge of the property's underlying value that constituted an undisclosed advantage in the asset division. Carolyn said, I had professional knowledge of soil science. I conducted unpaid private analysis of land I personally owned and had a familial and personal connection to. The mineral rights attachment was an explicit request, made through counsel in an arm's-length negotiation reviewed by competent attorneys on both sides. His appraiser used standard methodology for a standard county assessment. My own analysis was neither commissioned by the divorce proceedings nor required to be disclosed. Judith was quiet for a moment. That's what I told Fenwick. What did Fenwick say? He said he was advising Daniel to explore his options. What are Daniel's options? Judith's voice had the precise economy of a lawyer who has done the analysis. Limited, she said. But he's going to file. The claim was filed in January. It arrived at Gerald Puckett's office on a Thursday with Judith's forwarded copy, and Gerald read it over lunch and called Carolyn to summarize the position. Daniel was asserting that her professional standing as a trained soil science technician gave her access to material information about the property's subsurface value that constituted a hidden advantage in the settlement negotiation, and that the mineral rights transfer had been obtained as a result of this information asymmetry. Gerald read the filing language in the flat voice of a man who has seen creative legal arguments before and is unmoved by them. Carolyn said, How long do we have to respond? 60 days, he said. She said, How many pages is the response going to be? Gerald said, As many as it needs. It took 41 pages. The joint response from Gerald and Judith was filed in March. It included Carolyn's complete soil analysis documentation, every core sample from every site, every pH reading, every hydraulic conductivity measurement. The full chronological record from the first informal cores in 2016 through the final Site 7 confirmation in March 2020. It included a certified copy of the 1987 McLean County Water Resources Survey, obtained from the state archives, with a 2-page annotation showing exactly how it was accessed and by whom and when. It included the divorce appraiser's report with a technical note explaining the standard county methodology employed and its scope limitations. And it included a 43-page expert declaration from Dr. Patricia Shen at the University of Kentucky, a document that Patricia had written with the careful precision of a scientist who understands that her professional reputation depends on saying exactly what is supportable and nothing more. Patricia's declaration concluded in language that required a reader with some technical background to follow fully and that was unambiguous for anyone who could. That the artesian formation beneath the McLean parcel was documented in public records available since 1987. That its identification by Carolyn Pryor had been the product of professional expertise, private time, and her own equipment applied to land she personally owned. That the information was available to any trained hydrogeologist using standard methods, and that the county appraiser retained by the plaintiff's legal team had employed a standard surface-level assessment methodology that was entirely appropriate for the scope of a standard real property appraisal, and was not, by any professional standard, deficient. She also noted, in a single precise sentence near the end of the declaration, that the 1987 County Geological Survey was publicly available in the state archives and had been available without restriction since the date of its filing. Fenwick filed a response in April. Judith filed a surreply in May. The judge, the Honorable Marion Aldridge, McLean County Circuit, 18 years on the bench, read the full record over a weekend in June and set the matter for hearing on July 12th. The hearing was on a Tuesday morning. Carolyn drove to the courthouse in Calhoun on a clear July day with Gus in the truck and the windows down and the south field visible for a stretch of the county road, green and filling in well under the summer growth. She wore the gray blazer she kept for professional presentations and carried her field notebook in the bag on the passenger seat, because Judith had told her she might be asked to explain her methodology on the stand. The McLean County Courthouse was a limestone building from 1912 that sat on Courthouse Square with a wide front step and a flagpole and a parking lot that filled up early on hearing days. She parked in the back lot and walked around to the front. It was a clear morning, already warm at 8:30, the sky the particular deep July blue that makes everything look more defined than it usually does. The limestone of the building sharp against it, the flagpole's shadow thrown hard across the front walk. She had been inside this courthouse twice before in her professional life, both times to file extension program documentation at the county clerk's office. She knew where the circuit courtroom was. She walked directly to it. As she came around the corner, she saw Daniel's gray Chevy truck near the entrance. She had not seen Daniel in 4 years, not since the settlement signing, when they had sat across a table from each other in Judith's conference room and signed documents in a professional silence that was not hostile, but was the silence of two people who have already said everything and are completing a transaction. He was standing with Fenwick at the bottom of the courthouse steps. He had put on weight in his face, and he was wearing a jacket that was slightly too formal for the context, and he had the look of a man who has spent the past 7 months building a version of events that he believed in, and was now standing in front of a courthouse waiting to find out if a judge would believe in it too. When he saw Carolyn come around the corner, he straightened slightly. The kind of straightening that is not conscious, a posture adjustment, a preparation. He nodded once. She nodded once. She went inside. She sat with Judith and Gerald at the respondent's table and looked at her notebook, and did not look at Daniel while he and Fenwick settled at the petitioner's table across the courtroom. Judge Aldridge came in at 9. She reviewed the file. She had the particular quality of a judge who has read everything and has already reached a view and is conducting the formal proceedings because they are the appropriate form for this kind of conclusion to take. She asked Fenwick to present the claim. He did so in 12 minutes, making the argument that Carolyn's professional expertise constituted an informational advantage that created an inequitable negotiation. She asked Gerald to respond. He did so in 9 minutes, making the argument that professional expertise applied to privately owned land in one's own time was not a disclosable asset, that the information had been available in public records, and that the Mineral Rights Clause had been reviewed and accepted by competent counsel. Judge Aldridge asked Carolyn 2 questions. The first was about her professional qualifications and the standard methods of subsurface soil analysis. The second was about how she had first become aware of the 1987 Geological Survey. Carolyn answered both questions with the steady specificity of a person who has been giving technical testimony for 22 years and has never once been uncertain about the underlying data. The judge looked at the documentation in front of her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The court finds that the respondent's professional expertise as a soil science professional does not constitute a disclosable material interest under the standard for undisclosed asset advantage, in the absence of a specific joint appraisal agreement or fiduciary relationship with the petitioner. The respondent conducted analysis of her own inherited property using her own professional training and publicly available information. The mineral rights transfer was an explicit negotiating position reviewed and accepted by competent legal counsel on both sides. The claim is dismissed." She closed the file. She said, "That will be all." It had taken 40 seconds from the conclusion of the testimony to the ruling. Fenwick made a note on his yellow legal pad. Daniel sat still in his chair for a long moment, with a particular stillness that is not composure, but is what remains in the place where composure used to be. He had the look of a man who had told himself a clean and convincing story about what had happened, and had just watched a judge decline to ratify it. He stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair with the careful motions of a man managing his hands. He walked toward the exit without looking in the direction of Carolyn's table. She watched him go. She thought about the afternoon he had walked the northwest quadrant. 20 minutes. A look at the drainage patterns. A conclusion delivered to Roy Batterman from a standing position beside his truck. She thought about the settlement meeting where he had said, in the tone of a man making a generous concession, "The McLean place is all yours, Carolyn." She had said thank you. She had meant it in the way she had meant it, which was not the way he had taken it. Gerald stood beside her at the respondent's table and looked at the closed file. He said, "Dismissed with prejudice." He said it the way he said everything, without inflection. He cannot refile. She said, "I know." He said, "The Water Authority easement closes in 30 days." She said, "I know that." He picked up his briefcase. He said, "You've been knowing this for a long time." She said, "Long enough." He nodded once, the nod of a man who has decided that this is a sufficient summary, and went to hold the door for Judith. Carolyn drove home with the windows down, past the grain elevators at Calhoun, down the county road, through the gate, which was plumb and latched properly now, the gravel lane solid under the truck's wheels. She had put it in herself in May. 240 feet of crushed limestone, a rented compactor, 3 weekends. Gus had ridden in the passenger seat the whole way back, doing what he did, which was exist in the particular unhurried warmth of a dog who has decided that wherever his person is going is the correct destination. She parked at the barn and got out. The south field was full and green in the July light. The fences were tight and straight along all four boundaries. The barn stood solid, the two new wall sections weathering into the old ones, with the beginning of that gray and silver quality that old barns acquire when they are well maintained and given time. The drill pad on the northwest quadrant was quiet. The confirmation testing was complete, and the permanent extraction infrastructure would go in after the easement closed. Roy's truck was parked at his side of the boundary fence, with Roy leaning on the hood holding a thermos, watching the south field. He did this sometimes. He did it in the way of a man who watched land for 40 years and did not stop watching it when something worthwhile was happening. She walked to the fence. He handed her the thermos without comment. She poured a cup and handed it back. They stood at the fence and looked at the field. The July heat came off the cover crop in a warm, faintly sweet wave that was the smell of healthy soil beginning to recover, a smell she recognized from work and from something older than work. Roy said, after a while, "How'd it go?" "Dismissed," she said. He nodded. He looked at the south field. He said, "Your grandmother used to say that land tells you what it is, if you're willing to listen long enough." Carolyn looked at the green of the south field and thought about the pale, exhausted ground it had been in March 2 years ago, and about the core sample from Site 7 and the number she had written down in the notebook the first time the hydraulic conductivity came in different from everything around it. She thought about Ruth Aldridge, who had been told what was under the northwest field in 1974, and had decided, for reasons that were hers alone, to leave it for the person who came next. She had listened. She had listened for 3 years with a sampler and a notebook, and the professional knowledge of someone who spent 22 years understanding what land says beneath its surface. What it had said was unambiguous to the person who knew how to hear it. She was right, Carolyn said. Roy poured himself a cup from the thermos. They stood at the fence in the July heat and drank their coffee. After a while, she walked back to the barn and stood in the doorway. The workbench along the south wall was finished now, the oil coat cured, the crack filled and invisible, the surface smooth and dark and solid under her hand. The ball jars stood on their shelf earliest to the left. The cultivator teeth hung on their nails on the west wall, where Ruth had put them in 1961. The floor was level, the walls were straight, the roof was tight. The barn door was open, and the light inside was on. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment. What would you have done in Carolyn's position?